So let's just get started. First off, what makes a good horror comic for you guys? And jump in whenever you want to.
You're the master.
For me, horror, there are only two fields of writing that affect you emotionally, and that's horror and comedy. Because if it's not funny, you won't laugh, and if it doesn't creep you out, you're not scared. Those two appeal to you on a pure emotional basis. And everything else, whether it's superheroes, detective, science fiction, they're all, to use the word intellectual, in that they're things that you have to think about and story-driven that hits the brain. What makes a great horror comic is something that brings you in on an emotional basis, and that could be any subject matter. It can be any type of story you want to set up, but one that you have to emotionally react to, because that's what horror is. It's something that just creeps inside you, and if it doesn't do that, it's not a good horror story, whether it's in a comic book, a movie, a novel, short story, or anything else.
Yeah, to that point, I would say tone for me is a big issue, and I think, you know, we have a tendency, and it is sort of the Hollywood nature, and it's any business's nature, where if something works in one particular genre, then suddenly, okay, Quarantine just worked, get me a horror movie like Quarantine. And obviously we see that a lot in this genre specifically, and I think that understanding that a ghost story, for example, generally, and again, there are multiple tones within that sort of subset, but that and your zombie story per se, and understand, you know, what each is and what each tone is, and make sure, I think Kevin made the point of horror segging into comedy at some point, and that's a risky thing to align, you gotta watch. I think understand what you're writing and service it all the way through, and don't get lost in that. And it's a very easy mistake to make.
Well, I think a big one too is that when you're doing a comic book, because you're doing something that's obviously read and it's on paper, you have no control over timing. You can't do jump scares. You know, if I turn the page and you're like, "Oh my Jesus God!" It's not a cheap scare. I can't do that the way that you can do in a film. I mean, I can't, like, you know, "Oh my God, I thought it was a monster and it's actually my cute little dog." That's terrifying. I have to do things that make you. It's fear by sort of the tone, the sort of what it makes you feel like. And you know, I think some of the best horror comics are often the ones where, you know, it's very subtle, like a Neil Gaiman comic or something where, you know, you're not relying on, you know, just blood and gore, because it doesn't work as well in comics, I think, as it does in film. That doesn't make horror a hard genre to do in comics. You just have to do it slightly differently.
Yeah, I would say, you know, in a movie you have sound, which is a big crutch, because, I mean, like 60% of the scares come from the sound. If you watch a horror movie with the volume down, nothing's going to really, you know, freak you out. So in a comic, what you want to do is kind of plant these seeds in people's heads that's going to stay with them later. It's like when you get home at night and you're alone and you're walking to your front door, if you start, you know, if your imagination just starts going because something was planted in your head, you know, that's what you try to accomplish, is to scare people, or just make it so their imagination scares themselves later when they're alone.
Anyone else? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, my favorite horror comics are just, you know, ones that have nice breathing room and you know, try to build suspense as best as they can in the panels, and just stories that, you know, stick with you, that you're still thinking about the next day or a week later. And I guess lots of, in certain cases, you know, lots of the color red, and lots of blood, and...
So what you're saying is blood and boobies also make a good horror comic.
Yeah.
Just checking.
But no, I mean, Whitley just went through the experience of doing the Nye incidents, so you should tell them.
I know nothing. No, you know, it's interesting. I kind of got interested in the graphic representation of horror by sort of wandering into comic stores and finding books that I liked. I'm a golden age collector primarily, and that's my interest in comics. And this is sort of a new area for me. but it's really interesting, and I was thinking to myself the other day, you know, what the elements are that are really important in a horror comic or in any comic are really more the characters and the pictures than anything. And you could make a comic out of characters and pictures with absolutely no writing at all, and you could make it incredibly scary. It would really get under your skin. And I'm reminded when I think of how to make a graphic novel work or a comic work as scary, my mind always goes back to the old silent horror films and certain moments and certain ways of moving that some of those old characters had, and how that can come out graphically. It's very exciting stuff, and I think that we're on the kind of frontier with this type of comic. The scariest ones haven't been written yet, and I find that really exciting. You've got your own.
Yeah, I got one.
I keep forgetting they have a microphone.
I actually think something that's really unique and interesting about horror comic books is the length of time that you can develop the story for in an ongoing series. A lot of horror comic books have been anthologies, which would be very similar to existing horror television shows and stuff like that. But it's very different to do a horror comic book where you can be following these characters for years and years and years, as opposed to a horror movie where really it's who's going to survive until the end of the movie, and it's very self-contained. So I think something interesting is like the I, Frankenstein is a brilliant concept of how to take a monster into a long story, as opposed to, you know, how would you do that with the existing Frankenstein character in the movie. And it's always interesting to looking at it in a different medium. What do you need to do to create the story that's going to, you know, give these characters enough breathing room to, you know, follow through to the next level. And so that's something for me is very different if you're doing a series or a self-contained movie.
Yeah, I think all these gentlemen are correct. One of the things I like to do, though, I like to use horror motifs and spin them on their head and create something that's a little bit more cool. Because I guess in this modern day, I mean, we all know these things are going to get turned into movies eventually. And so how to give them an extended life in other ways. And so part of what I was thinking with Underworld, I never did really like vampires, but I was approached first on how to do a type of werewolf movie that essentially was what Marv did with Blade. And so in thinking about it, I was like, you know, that's a cool idea, but how can I spin it on its head? Make it more scientific, make it different, and come up with something that feels familiar but is unique. Then you mix in vampires, which is a traditional horror, you know, character, and turn it into something really cool, really slick. And with zombies, I try to do the same thing. Turn them into weaponized characters, and that gives it more of a political temper, something we haven't seen before, something that can be cool and slick. And I continue the trend with I, Frankenstein, and they got picked up as films. So I think if you look at horror differently, as well as the way these gentlemen look at it, you can do a lot of interesting things.